minute. Gave everybody a second to get in here, and then we'll get this show on the road. Oh, I know there's a bit of a delay. So, ooh, uno momento. I'm back. All right, we are live. This week we're talking shotguns. And I know what's going on, AJ. I know that duck season's coming. If it's not already open where you're at, if it didn't open this past weekend, it's probably going to open this next weekend. I know it opens this coming weekend here in Florida. Some places I know had youth hunts. Some places are just open, which is great. We're just going to talk about the different gauges of shotguns, what the gauge means, talk about some old stuff like punt guns. I'd love to have a punt gun. And, get into stuff like that. But before we kick this show off, this week's episode is brought to you by Deep Roots Rifle Company, elevated excellence rooted in integrity and reliability. Use the link in the description to get on over to their website and order just about everything you'll need to get into the woods this fall, from a fully custom rifles built in-house to flashlights to help you find your way in the dark. And be sure to use code UPO10 at checkout for 10% off your order. Also, slide down in the description of the podcast here or the video, and there is a link directly to that Staccato P pistol, the 2011. It's a double stack 9mm 1911 style pistol, absolutely beautiful. You can buy seats, quote unquote seats, to the webinar, and then underneath one of those seats for the webinar is going to be a winning ticket. You don't have to be present in the webinar to win said prize, but what's going on, Tyke? If your seat is chosen, whether you attend the webinar or not about the pistol, you'll still be able to win it. So I think there were 32 seats left over when I checked earlier. I can check again. And it looks like you can actually go in there and select what seats you want. So they're numbered 1 through 50, and they're $50 a piece. So for you're talking like a $1,200, $2,500, sorry, MSRP for that Staccato. So that's 9x19. It's a 17+1 or 20+1 capacity, 4 to 4.5 pound crisp and clean single action trigger, 4.4-inch bull barrel, weighs 33 ounces. It's a steel frame, 4140 steel frame, 4.4-inch toolless Dawson precision recoil system, and it looks beautiful. So, yeah, there's two 17-round mags with it. So, only thing is they can't ship it to Massachusetts or California if you're not an active duty law enforcement officer. So that sucks. Live in a freer state. Sorry, Tyke. But let's jump into shotguns. So shotguns seem to come in more sizes than you can find shoes at Walmart. And I'm not sure whether that means there's a lot of shotgun sizes or maybe it's a dig at Walmart's shoe selection. Some of them have just as much kick. So today we're breaking down every gauge that's ever mattered, from the practical 12 gauge. I think that probably everyone's uncle swears it's all you'll ever need, all the way back to the 8 gauge market hammers and punt guns that basically committed war crimes against ducks. So we're digging into where gauges came from, why the numbers make no sense, and which ones actually earn their place in the field today. So the gauge is probably one of the weirdest measuring systems ever. Gauge is one of those leftover ideas from the black powder days that somehow didn't get thrown out with the leaves and bloodletting. It's based on how many lead balls the size of your bore makes a pound. So the bigger the number, the smaller the bore. It's like clove size, but backwards and with more recoil. That's why a 12 gauge is bigger than a 20 gauge, and why something like a 410 is basically a tiny sniper rifle pretending to be a shotgun. And 410, which we'll get into this later, is not actually a gauge. 410, I think it's like a 64 gauge. It's actually a bore diameter, one of the only shotguns measured by its bore size. So a 12 gauge takes 12 balls, 20 gauge takes 20, 16, 28, so on and so forth. So when, right, 410.410, it's a 410 bore. Pretty sure it's a 64 or 68 gauge. When shotguns were large, like 5 gauge and 8 gauge, in the punt gun era, the 8 gauge, was the waterfowl gun before conservation laws existed. The kind of gun you take when the ducks are sitting way out there and you don't care which state you knock them into. These things drew through volcanic payloads of lead. The pattern wasn't so much a cone as it was a suggestion, but it got the job done. And when the job was lots of ducks very quickly, I mean, it was out there. I would still love to, if I could get my hands on an old 5 gauge or an 8 gauge. I know they exist. I've seen the shells. Nobody makes them anymore, basically because they were regulated out of existence. So it's not that they weren't effective. They were just too effective. So, but I would love to shoot one. I know it's going to hurt, but I just want to do it. Then there was the 5 gauge. So the 5 gauge shouldn't be shouldered by anything without a death wish. And I've got a death wish. You got a 5 gauge and I can shoot it, let me know. I want to try. Most people have never seen one, and that's probably for the best. 5 gauge is basically a mobile thunderstorm with a trigger. That sucker, huge. I'm talking not quite as big as this bottle, but it feels like it is when you look at it compared to a 12 gauge. It's about twice as big as a 10 gauge. And it didn't say you probably didn't need 3.5 out of that one, or 4.5. Not sure how big they got. And then you got the punt guns, which that's another one I would love to shoot. Now, I know you don't shoulder fire a punt gun. If the 8 gauge was big and the 5 gauge was ridiculous, the punt gun was outright disrespectful. Think about like that little hand cannon you see on the side of a pirate ship in the pirate movies where the guy's just one little tiny cannon. That's the thing about that, but mounted with a longer barrel in the front of a P-row. These were literal cannons strapped to these boats. They fired up to 1 pound of shot at once. And when you're talking small BBs, that's a lot. Market hunters would sneak up on rafts of ducks, and rafts being like big groups of sleeping ducks on the water, and fire the punt gun. And the recoil would shove the boat backwards, like someone yanked the emergency brake. They dropped entire flocks in one shot. It was effective. Brutal, but effective. Conservation stepped in eventually. Otherwise, ducks would now be mythical creatures. And we see that. You know, we've talked about Ducks Unlimited, and this goes back to like the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty, and then all the protections on ducks and the duck stamp and all this, because market hunting, they weren't killing the ducks for meat. They're killing the ducks for feathers. So they're just laying them down in droves and pulling feathers. And I'm sure there's plenty of eating going on there, and there may have been a side market for it back in town, but the feathers were getting shipped off to go in hats and pillows, and, you know, you got it down somewhere. So the 10 gauge is the survivor of that era. The 10 gauge outlived its bigger cousins and carved out a niche as the big water, big bird option. It's the friend that doesn't show up often, but when it does, it means business. I think you still see it probably in a lot of geese hunting. Heavy payloads, dense patterns, and guns that weigh enough to double as gym equipment. The 10 gauge is still around, like I said, geese, turkey, especially for folks who just want more everything. The 10 gauge is for the guy who feels like the 3.5 inch and the 12 gauge is not enough. Plain and simple. Then we get into the 12 gauge, which you could call it the undisputed king. Okay, it's probably the most common shotgun shell out there. The 12 gauge is the Swiss Army knife of shotguns. If you only ever shot 1 gauge, odds are it was a 12. It does upland. It does ducks. It does deer. It does turkeys. It does home defense. It does competitive shooting. It does everything except your taxes. The selection of ammo is insane, from light loads to like the little 1.5 inch mini shells. all the way to heavy load steel, bismuth, lead, magnum slugs. There's 12 gauge load for every purpose except brushing your teeth. I've killed deer with a 12 gauge. I've killed ducks with a 12 gauge. I've killed doves, snipe, squirrels, you name it. Done it with a 12 gauge. I've shot 3-inch magnum slugs out of a 12 gauge with Tyke here, and between the two of us, we're only able to get 7 rounds off, and I left more bruised from that hunt or from that shooting session than probably any other time I've spent on the range. That was brutal. Then you got the 16 gauge, which I think is such a cool. I would love to get, if I could find a nice side by side in 16 gauge. That's an excellent gauge for duck hunting. Just kind of more of an all around bigger gauge. I've got some 16 gauge slugs over there on the shelf. The 16 gauge used to be royalty, the perfect upland gauge, 12 gauge punch in a lighter package. Then gun companies stopped making proper 16 gauge frames and saddled it with chunky 12 gauge receivers. That's like wearing steel toe boots to run a marathon. But it's making a comeback. The modern 16s are sleek again, the way they were meant to be, and they handle like a dream for anyone who spends hours walking behind a dog. You used to, and there was a time too when the old Browning A5s, if you get the Belgian ones, you got to be careful because some of those won't accept a 2 3/4 inch 16 gauge. They'll only accept a 2.5, and which means you can load 16 gauge, your regular 16 gauge you can buy now, into it, because I don't know if you know this. Here's a cool thing about shotgun shells: they're not measured closed; they're measured open. So once they're fired, that's when the shell's measured. So it'll fit a 2.5. You can put a 2 3/4 in it. It'll load. It'll chamber. It'll fire, but it won't eject because the ejection port's not big enough. I've heard of guys having that ejection port enlarged so they can shoot that 2 3/4 16 gauge. And that 2.5 inch 16 gauge is really tough to find. Although I'm sure you could probably make it if you reloaded. So, and then the 20 gauge. 20 gauge is fastly becoming one of my favorite ones to shoot for hunting doves and squirrels and stuff like that. I've got a nice little pump action Ithaca 20 gauge, and I can slam fire it. Slam fire meaning you can pull the trigger, and as I pump, if I hold the trigger down, when I bring the pump back forward, boom, it goes off again. The 20 gauge has always been smooth, light, easy to carry option. They're great for upland, great for small game, great for anyone who doesn't want to get kicked into next week. They're also great for a slug gun. You're getting roughly the same size slug as you do out of a 12 gauge with just a little bit less powder in it. Or you're getting a little bit smaller slug with about the same amount of powder. And you see guns like the Savage 220 are stacking 20 gauge slugs. It's a bolt action rifle barrel slug gun stacking 20 gauge slugs on top of one another at 100 yards. That's 250 yard slug gun for those states that require you to hunt with a shotgun or muzzleloader during deer season if you want to go that way. So, and then the TSS came along with the 20 gauge and turned the 20 into an absolute turkey slaying machine. Okay. Suddenly the 20 gauge wasn't just a lighter alternative. It was the gun people chose because it hits harder than the old 12 gauge lead loads with half the recoil. So then we get into the real cool niche sub gauges, the 28 gauge and the 410. So the 28 gauge is the gauge people try once and then get unreasonably attached to. It's light, it's efficient, it patterns like it's cheating. Upland birds, especially the fast, fluttery, infuriating kind, like snipe, fall cleanly to the 28. And thanks to tungsten, even turkey hunters have joined the party. And then there's the 410. Okay, small, sassy, underestimated, not technically a gauge, but we let it sit at the table anyway. The 410 used to be a squirrel gun, the snake gun, the kid's gun. The gun you give to someone when you're not ready to trust them with the recoil. But again, tungsten changes things. You got the modern 410 turkey loads are nasty. They're throwing patterns that would make your granddad swear you're lying if he didn't see it himself. It was the first gun that my son shot, hunted squirrels with, a little 410. I love that little thing. I'll hang on to it, get slugs for it, shoot buckshot out of it. I know a lot of guys have killed their first deer shooting a 410 slug. You can get 410 triple lot buck, and it's got like 4 BBs in it, 3-inch or something like that, 4 or 5 BBs. Plenty enough for pigs inside of 50, 60 yards. So who does it best? Okay, so waterfowl, I'd say 12 gauge runs the marsh, but 10 gauge still lurks in the shadows, waiting for the goose that stays just a little too far out. When it comes to upland, 20 gauge owns the hills. 16 gauge is the classic, and 28 gauge is pure style points. When you see the guy break out the 28 gauge, that's when you know you're in trouble. Because if he's breaking out the 28 gauge for upland bird, he's had some practice with it, and you're not going to kill anything until he's done. Turkey, if you want to flatten a bird, 12 gauge. If you want modern efficiency, 20 gauge. If you want to feel like John Wick in the spring woods, 410. When it comes to deer, slugs rule the game, and that's going to be your 12 or your 20. Saboted slug from either will drop a deer so hard they won't know what caliber hit them. I mean, I've shot deer with a 12 gauge slug at 30 yards, and I shot a doe, and when she wheeled around, she had a chunk along the size of my fist hanging out the other side, and I said, "Oh, she did. She didn't go 20. She probably went about 35 yards." Small game, 20 for versatility, 28 for fun, 410 if you want to test your self-esteem. And then predators, 12 gauge with TSS or buckshot. Coyotes don't like it. There was can't remember what company made them. It was called Dead Coyote, and we would shoot that through the Dead Coyote choke. Pretty sure it's Dead Coyote choke, super tight choke, and you could get that Dead Coyote, and it's probably TSS now I think about it. Before it was cool, something like that. But you could get that crap to pattern. It would pattern on a cinder block at 80 yards. You could dust a cinder block with it. And dude, you talk about laying coyotes out. And it's great when you're hunting coyotes, especially you're hunting in a 2-man team. You got one guy with a rifle and one guy with a shotgun. Because especially if you've done it down here in the South, where you don't have the big rolling hills like you have in the Midwest. I've been sitting on a field, and I know the coyotes are here, and I'm calling, waiting for them to come out. I've hit them with a locate call, so I know I've got a pack across the field, and I'm thinking I'm going to bring them out into the field on the other side to get a 200-300 yard shot. And next thing you know, a coyote pops out 15 yards to my right. Well, you're kind of screwed with the rifle. It's a tough shot. You can try and make it, but that's when your shotgun guy comes in. So you ask, why did these gauges survive? All the gauges that made it through history did so because they found a niche. 12 gauge survived because it was the do-it-all hammer. 20 gauge survived because it's light and it's deadly. 16 gauge stayed because upland folks are stubborn, and I think 16 gauge is just chef's kiss. 28 gauge stuck around because it's magic in a tube. 410 survived because, well, it's fun. It's time to start betting some nickels and some beers on who can hit what with the 410. And the big old 8 gauge and 5 gauges, they faded out. They didn't fade out. They were regulated off the face of the earth for being too effective. Same with punt guns. They're basically the Thanos of the marsh. So shotgun gauges aren't just numbers stamped on a barrel. They're artifacts of history engineered for decades of trial and error and recoil lessons learned the hard way. They're great guns. They are, especially now with all the modern chokes and the different sizes. And now, I mean, I know that for the longest time, we had lead, and then we switched to steel, late 80s, early 90s. When it came, I believe it was around that time when it became federally mandated, we shoot non-toxic shot. And then we had, what's that stuff called? Bismuth step onto the market, with it being denser than steel, which made it absolutely fantastic. Guys were getting better patterns. It was grouping and shooting more like lead, but it's non-toxic, right? And now bismuth has become very hard to get a hold of. So you got, I guess Boss is making a copper shell now, which I don't understand because copper is less dense than steel, but we've all kind of come back around to steel. I know some guys shoot TSS for geese and sandhill cranes, but man, that is way too rich for my blood because you're talking $50 for a box of 5 TSS for turkey season. I don't even shoot it for turkey season. I shoot copper plated lead for turkey season. And the reason you're shooting copper plated lead would be it's going to help it hold its shape a little better. So you get a little better flight out of it. But that copper plated lead, man, dude, shooting it out of I've got a 12 gauge Viper Max, so 3.5 inch TriStar Viper Max. And I'm shooting copper plated lead, 4, 5, and 6 combo, a 3.5 inch turkey load through a Carlson's Longbeard XR. And that sucker will hold 20-inch group at 50 yards. And it's almost all the BBs inside that 18, 20-inch group. I almost can't shoot a turkey closer than 15 yards because the group is so tight to that choke. And then we've talked to other choke manufacturers like, I can't think of his name. He makes the UFO. They're a little more expensive, but you can run anything through his chokes. Mueller chokes. That man has got those chokes down. Like he's using rocket science to figure those chokes out. And they're wonderful. Jim shoots one of those chokes, and it's just a great choke. But the way he makes them, you can literally run steel, lead, buckshot, whatever. He doesn't care. You're not going to screw the choke up. But you got to be careful with some of that. So it's good stuff. Shotguns are fun. Shotguns are very versatile. You're not getting distance out of a shotgun that you are out of a rifle, but in the thick woods down here, dude, buckshot, slugs, shooting Foster slugs, which is what they call a rifled slug, which actually isn't rifled. The fins that you see on a Foster slug aren't designed to make it spin in the barrel, but to stabilize it in flight. And they hold pretty well. I mean, you can get about a minute of a pie plate out of a 12 gauge Foster slug at 100 yards. So get some of those, give it a shot. Those work for you shooting slugs out of that, aiming right down the rib of the barrel with a bead on the end. Get after it for deer. And you got, shotgun gauges aren't just numbers stamped on a barrel. They're artifacts of history, engineering, and decades of trial and error, and recoil lessons learned the hard way. From boat-mounted cannons to featherweight upland guns, every gauge earned its place. Some of them survived. Some of them got outlawed. Now, it doesn't mean they're illegal to own. It just means you can't hunt with them most of the time anymore. If you look at regulations, it'll say 10 gauge would be the biggest you can hunt with, and then it'll name shot sizes you can use and so on and so forth, depending on what you're hunting. And some exist today because they simply make the experience more enjoyable. Like the 410, man. I would not mind getting a little semi-automatic 410 or pump-action 410. It'd be fun to dove hunt with. Hunt some dove or some quail with one. Right now, I'll stick to the 20 gauge. I feel like a big man when I kill, stuff on the wing with a 20 gauge. A lot less BBs, a lot less recoil. Fun gun to carry around, real lightweight. We'll get there one day. And then maybe after that, I'll start hunting doves with the longbow. Like a lunatic. But thanks for hanging out. We'll deep dive into shotguns, and maybe we'll break down some species next. Ducks, turkeys, pheasants, whatever. We'll crack that one open next time, maybe. But other than that, we'll catch you guys next week.